weeks.
6 months?
6 months.
Daniel chapter 7.
It's been a while for Easter weekend, and then
Last week we actually started chapter 7. We split it in half. So let me just kind of review some of that from last week, which we didn't record last week because we had a technical glitch. That was all my fault. But let's see. All right, last week, Daniel chapter 7. So here we have Daniel's first dream, the vision of the 4 beasts. So just to remind you, if you look at verse 1, this was this dream occurred during Belshazzar's reign. If you remember, he was the king of Babylon back in chapter 5. We see his death, and we go on to Cyrus, etc. But here we're not going chronological. We're going back to Belshazzar's reign to pick up this vision. So again, here in chapter 7 and following, we're looking at prophetic scripture, where 1 through 5 was really historical scripture, and so we're going to be looking at the various prophecies, and they come in a different order than we had in chapters 1 through 6. So here in chapter 7, we have a really nice outline of history from Belshazzar's reign all the way through all of Christ's new kingdom, and so. Then when we get to chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, it really goes into more detail on some of those things. So we will be taking a broad brush here in chapter 7, and then as we get into the other chapters, we'll be getting into a lot more detail. So I will say we are going into a lot of the eschatology stuff in these chapters. There'll be so as I've said before, I'm learning as I'm going. So we'll figure things out as we go. You will ask me questions about the end times, and I will not know the answer to them because we haven't studied that part yet. So I'm just going to be sharing what we've learned in these chapters, and we'll learn more in the next chapters, etc. So just so you know that ahead of time. All right. So first of all, what we talked about last week was this new kingdom. We jumped to the end and looked at Christ's kingdom and what it was about, his coronation as the king, some characteristics of this new kingdom, particularly the authority that Christ will have, the honor and respect due to him. We made a big point that this kingdom is a real kingdom here on earth. It's we're not talking about a spiritual kingdom. We're talking about a real kingdom where he rules. And there are real people on the earth while he rules. Also made the point that just for clarity, that this occurs this is the 1,000-year reign that's talked about in Scripture, which is the first part of kind of an eternal kingdom that Christ begins when he comes onto the earth. It's just the first 1,000 years are here on the earth, and then the rest of his kingdom lasts forever. So that's where we were in talking about this kingdom and making sure, we get sometimes caught up in all the things leading up to the kingdom, but I don't want you to miss the point that this kingdom is a pretty awesome thing that we're going to be a part of, and just don't want you to miss that part. All right, so at this point then we're going to jump back. Actually, you would jump all the way back to verse 1 to look at the chronology. In other words, when is this going to happen? And so by the end of today, you'll know exactly when Christ's kingdom will come. You'll be able to, mark that on the calendar and know exactly when it's going to happen. Anyway, so let's just begin reading in verse 1, and then we'll get into the pieces of it. So again, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while he was in his bed. And then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and the 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. So first of all, the great sea that he talks about there in verse 2, typically that's associated with the Mediterranean, but here he's using it as a picture of humanity, right? He's saying that humanity was stirred up. Humanity was in chaos. and they were stirred up by the four winds of heaven. Typically, the number 4 is the number that represents Earth, and so really talking about the four corners of the Earth here. So all humanity and all of Earth was stirred up is really the picture that's being painted by those verses. And then in verse 3, we see that the four great beasts that came up from the sea. So they come out of humanity, these four great beasts, each different from each other. These are four, as we'll see, these are four kingdoms, four superpowers, if you will. What we'll see here is he talks about these as beasts, right, as ferocious beasts, as we get into verse 4 and following. It's interesting that when we talk back in chapter 2 of Nebuchadnezzar's vision, remember we had the idol statue, it was gold on top and then silver, bronze, iron, remember? And Nebuchadnezzar's dream, this was a great and glorious thing, these great kingdoms, how wonderful they would be as they followed each other. But here now we have a picture of those same kingdoms, but from God's perspective. God, as he relates them to Daniel, relates them as beasts, as cruel, as monsters, as wild and bloody things. So it's really interesting, right, from man's perspective, these kingdoms are glorious, but from God's perspective, they're wild beasts. So it's interesting that these two different perspectives we see essentially around the same kingdoms that we'll be talking about. So I'm going to be giving you some clues as to when the end time is going to come. So here you get your first clue. And that is that the kingdom of Christ, this final kingdom, follows the final kingdom of the nations, right? So we have these four beasts that come up. We'll be talking about these four kingdoms. So the kingdom of Christ follows the final kingdom of the nations, right? That's your first clue. Now, verse 4. We'll go through these kingdoms. The first one was like a lion. It had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. So again, the first kingdom that he's talking about is Babylon, right? The lion is representative of Babylon. You see also here that it has the lion and it has eagle's wings. Interesting thing is that scholars were confused about what that meant for many years until they actually did some archaeology over in Babylon, and they actually found some statues of lions with eagle's wings. It was a symbol of Babylon even in its day. And so when he talks here about the lion with eagle's wings, he's definitely talking about Babylon. Now, then he says the wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. There's two different interpretations of this. One is that at some point in time, the power that was Babylon got taken away, and it was simply like a man rather than like a beast. The other interpretation I actually like more, which is that this is a representation of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, right? If you remember, he was like a beast roaming in the fields, eating the grass and all that, and essentially he was made to stand on 2 feet, and a man's heart was given to him. His heart returned after time spent as a beast in the field. So either of those things could be possible for the interpretation of what we have at the end there of verse 4, but it's definitely the first kingdom about Babylon is what we see. Right, then the second beast in verse 5, suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise and devour much flesh. So the second kingdom, if you remember, was the Medo-Persian kingdom. Notice that it said that it was raised up on one side. Even though we call it the Medo-Persian Empire, it was always more Persian than Medo. The Medes were, even though they were an older race, they were kind of taken over. And we'll talk about that a lot more when we get to chapter 8. But the Persian part was a much stronger part. So when they talk about one side was raised up on one side, that's the Persian side, even though it was the Medo-Persians. Remember when we talked to Nebuchadnezzar, this was the 2 arms. There were 2 pieces. There's always 2 pieces of this kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. And then it says it had 3 ribs in its mouth. what this refers to is when the Medes actually conquered and took over. When the Medes and Persians conquered and took over, they actually conquered three major kingdoms. The Babylonians, obviously, as we we just read about, but then also they went down to Egypt and went down into Lydia. So they expanded the kingdom considerably southward towards Egypt and Lydia, and included all of Babylon. So it ends up right. They devoured much flesh. They were very ferocious. They were very they were all about blood and killing and making sure everyone was in subjection to them. And so you see that in the words that are used there. All right, then we go on to verse 6. It says, "After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, or some may say a panther, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." So first of all, it was a leopard or a panther with 4 wings. This is really talking about speed. And you remember that the third kingdom is Greece. So this is Alexander the Great. And for those of you who remember, he actually conquered the whole known world in 12 years. It was an incredibly fast takeover and fall of the Persian Empire when Alexander took over. So when it talks about the leopard with 4 wings on his back, it just talks about the speed with which Alexander did his conquest. It is interesting at the end that it talks about dominion was given to it, right? It was even though Alexander did the killing and such, it's still under God's control. The dominion, the kingship was given to him by God. It's not something he did on his own. And then the last thing is the beast also had 4 heads. Again, we talked about this in chapter 2, but when Alexander was killed, he was actually killed when he was 33 years old. When he was killed, 4 of his generals took over the northeast, south, and west of the kingdom. And so it was divided among those are the 4 heads then of the beast after Alexander the Great. All right, so that's the easy part of this part of the lesson. When we get to Rome and verse 7, it gets more complicated. All right, so after this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful, terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So first of all, this 4th beast, he doesn't associate it with a real animal. It's so it's so terrible, so dreadful that he can't even think of a beast to say it's like. It's an incredibly dreadful and terrible beast. The association with the iron teeth connects it directly with Rome. Again, you remember the feet of iron. Here we have iron teeth. We're talking about Rome here. No question about that. Let me just see. Now, if you remember last week, let me just pause here a minute. If you remember last week, we said that in this particular dream, Daniel gives the revelation of the dream. He then gives some interpretation of the dream, and then he actually gets some help from an angel for the interpretation of the dream. So I just want you to turn to verse 19 a minute. This is in the midst of, in fact, let's just start at verse 15 so you get the context of verse 19. After he receives this vision in verse 15, it says, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions in my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. These great beasts which are 4 kings which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. We'll come back to that. Verse 19, that I wish to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue under its feet. So here again you have this, you have the description of this 4th beast. Let's go back to verse 7. At the end of verse 7, right, it says that it had 10 horns. was different from the other beasts that were before it in that it had 10 horns. Now, the interpretation of the 10 horns is where it gets complicated. I actually want you to go to Revelations chapter 17. We're going to look at two different passages of Revelations to try to get a better understanding of these 10 horns. Revelations chapter 17, verse 12. There's a lot more detail about this kingdom in Revelation 17, but I just want to pick out this one verse for now. Revelation 17:12, it says, "And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast." And then go to Revelation chapter 13, and we'll look at verse 3. Revelation 13:3, and it says, "And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast." So start there. If you have a mortal wound, if you have a deadly wound, what normally happens to you?
Yeah,
Right. So that this mortal wound was healed. Right, then you see the whole world marveled at that. This was just kind of an amazing thing. Something that was thought to be dead is alive again, right? And so you notice in Revelation 17, what we looked at, right, it's the 10 kings, and it says that they had not yet received their kingdom. And here we have something that was mortally wounded and essentially came back to life again. We touched on this briefly when we looked at Nebuchadnezzar's vision back in chapter 2. There is the belief that the kingdom of Rome will come back. It will come back with 10 kings, even though it's mortally wounded, even though it's gone at this point in time. The belief through Scripture, there's many other places that talk about this. I've just taken these two pointed ones out for you. It's the belief that the kingdom of Rome will come back in some form. Now, there are those who believe that the European Union is the rebirth of Rome with 10 countries. I'm not one of those who predicts the future, so I'm not gonna go there. But you certainly can see that could possibly be it, or some form of that could be. But again, it would be the resurrection of this. Of Rome in some state is the fourth kingdom that goes forward. It was dead and it rises again. So let me add to my clues. Right, my clues. The next add to the clue here is that the kingdom of Christ will follow the final form of the final kingdom of the nations. Need a drink. Let me say that again. The kingdom of Christ will follow the final form of the final kingdom of the nations, right? So there's a final form, which is these 10 kings which rule in Rome. That is the final form of this final kingdom. The kingdom of Christ will not happen until that final form is in place. Okay? Just nod your heads if you at least understand that part. Okay, we're going to keep going then. All right, now I want you to move to verse 8. So verse 8 says, "And I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words." I want you to go over to verse 20. And again, look at the angel's interpretation of this. We read verse 19. Let's look at verse 20. And it says, "And the 10 horns that were on his head, and the other horn which came up before it, which 3 fell, namely the horn which had eyes, and the mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows." Let's skip over to verse 24. right? And it says the 10 horns are the 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise. So first of all, right, that repeats what we just read in Revelations, right? The 10 horns are 10 kings. They're going to arise out of this kingdom. And another shall rise after them, and he shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and laws. The saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. We'll get to the times in all a minute. But let's just first of all talk about this kingdom that is reborn. Then we have this horn business going on, right? We have this small horn which rises to take over the 10 kingdoms that are in this final form of the final kingdom. So let's look at some of the characteristics of this small horn. First of all, it's small, right? It begins as a small horn. It's something insignificant, something you wouldn't expect. It doesn't come in bombastically into the scene. It kind of comes in through the back door, if you will. If you look at verse 8, you notice that it says, before horn 3 of the first horns were plucked out by its roots. They kind of pushed the others out of the way. It was kind of a gradual replacement. All of a sudden, this one became more important than the other ones. If you look at, we won't go there, but if you look in Revelation chapter 6, it talks about the rider on a horse coming in as a part of the end times with a bow on his back, but it says that the bow doesn't have any arrows. Somehow he does this conquering. Somehow he takes over without a fight. It's all agreed, some kind of political takeover, if you will. They all agree that he's the one to take over, and he does so. If you turn real quickly to Daniel chapter 11, let's look at verse 21. Daniel 11:21. It says, "And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor and royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue." Right. So there's some kind of political intrigue that goes on, and this small horn takes over and is now in charge of the whole new Roman Empire, if you will, because of political intrigue. So first of all, he's some kind of political genius in order to pull this off. The second thing is, you notice that it talks about the eyes all around, right? He has eyes all around. Where am I? Verse 7, verse 8, I believe, right? Where it talks about he has eyes all around. So that symbol always is talking about intelligence. The guy is a genius. He's very smart. He can see things that other people cannot see. He's able to solve the world's problems, whatever those world's problems are at that time. He's able to solve them. He comes in to solve the world's problems, and everybody goes, "Wow, this guy is great. Let's bring him in. He's going to solve all the world's problems." The guy is a genius. He really does understand how to fix things. If you notice over in verse 20, he had eyes. We talked about his eyes in the middle of the verse, and his mouth, which spoke pompous words. There's no question that the guy is articulate. He has oratorical ability. We see it again in verse 25 when he speaks pompous words. This is somebody who tickles ears, right? We love to listen to this guy. He's on all the television stations. The other thing in verse 20, you notice that it says he spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. This is some beautiful person too, right? He's attractive. He speaks good. He's smart. He can solve all the world's problems. He's a political genius. We love this guy. We think he's great. Now we'll look at verse 25 again. He speaks pompous words against the Most High, but then all of a sudden it says he shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change the times and laws. Again, as we go into Revelations, we won't go into it now. We'll see this guy is a military genius also. He comes sneakily into the kingdom. He gets himself in charge, but all of a sudden he changes his stripes, right? And he turns particularly against the Jews, particularly against God's chosen, and persecutes them. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But Militarily, this guy is a genius. He's figured out how to take over. He's figured out how to get the right people on his side in order to rule the world at this particular time. The other thing, notice, I read it a couple of times here, but in verse 25, again at the first part, it says, "He shall speak pompous words against the Most High." Some of the translations actually say alongside the Most High. He sets himself up as God. He speaks like God. He speaks God's words, if you will. People think when he speaks, it's God speaking. He's speaking alongside of God. He's agreeing, especially in the first part of his rule, he's agreeing with God. People see him as a religious leader. They want to follow him because he's a religious leader. They love him. He does all these wonderful things. He speaks just like God. He's quoting the Bible. I mean, this guy is amazing. If you look over at Daniel again, Daniel chapter 11, again, we get a lot more details when we get into these future verses, so I'm just pulling a couple of things out. But Daniel chapter 11, verse 36, it's talking about him here, and he says, "Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all." Right? So he begins as this religious leader, but eventually he sets himself up as God himself. And by this time, he has won over the world, and they believe he is God. It's kind of an amazing thing. The other thing I just want to point out in verse 24, it talks about him subduing 3 kings. So of the 10, he subdues 3 kings before he takes over. Do y'all know what that is? If you do, you'll be better than any of the scholars that I've read, because nobody knows what that is. So this is something that happens in the future that no one has predicted. But at some point in time, after we have these 10 kings, somehow he subdues 3 of those kings before he kind of, in other words, he probably kills 3 of those kings, or somehow takes over their land before he rules over the whole country.
Rich, those are the same kings that are uprooted, the 3 horns that are uprooted, or no?
Yes. Same thing. The 3 horns that are pushed out of power, if you will, right? That were uprooted. Yes. Same 3 kings. Right. So let's go back to our clues here. So we've got now the kingdom of God follows the final ruler of the final form of the final kingdom of the nations, right? So we have now this kingdom of Rome in its final form, and now we see here its final ruler, this small horn which is now taken over, and the kingdom of Christ follows that final ruler of the final form of the final kingdom of the nations. All right, which is very clear now when this is, right? Okay. Let's get Let's talk some more about this persecution. Go back to verse 21 again. It says, "And I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them." We saw the same thing in verse 25. And the second sentence there says, "He shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall attend to change times and laws. Then the saints shall be given into his hands for a time, and a times, and half a time." So here we're actually talking about the final persecution, the tribulation, whatever word you want to use. The first part of his reign is pretty quiet, but the second part of his reign, he really turns on the saints. Now, I will ask this question: who are the saints?
Believers.
Believers
Believers that are left behind.
Believers that are left behind? What does that mean?
Welcome back, Russell.
He says, you know,
Learn. Come on.
Are you watching some movie there or something? What? What are the believers? What are you saying there? What are these believers?
Is it
Who are these believers?
144,000 that they mentioned, I guess, in Revelation? And
So where are the rest of the believers?
we are raptured, as far as I believe.
Okay, so this is the debatable point here. Okay, is when does the rapture come? Does the rapture come before the tribulation? Does the rapture come after the tribulation? So let me just say up front, there are really good people who believe on both sides of this equation. So this is one of those things where I'm probably not going to come down real firm and say this is exactly it. Now, as we go through, you're going to see evidence for both of these things, right? And so we'll deal with that, and I'll probably state a position at some point in time and then change my mind later. But here, you know, there is tribulation of some kind of saints during. Excuse me. There is persecution of some saints during the tribulation. If there is the rapture comes before the tribulation, then there are saints that are saved during the tribulation, right? And these are, some people refer to the 144,000. There are those that are.
That's what I meant. He knows that.
Left behind, just to be clear. They were saved after the rapture. They were saved during the persecution when other things occur. So just to be clear, there is some persecution that occurs, and during the tribulation, obviously. But there are some believers during that time, and this is at least some during that time, and we'll deal with that later at another time. All right, the other thing I wanted to deal with in this verse was the time and times and half a time. Anybody know what that means?
The 3.5 years.
3.5 years, good. So the way that's interpreted is that time is a year, times are 2 years, and half a time is half a year. So you get 1 plus 2 plus a half, that comes up to 3.5 years. So he's saying that the tribulation will last 3.5 years. Does that make sense to y'all? I thought the tribulation lasted 7 years.
If you're a bit triple.
Yes, exactly. Depends on what you believe.
All right, so the tribulation lasts 7 years. But there is a halfway point through the tribulation, that 3.5 years, where the second half is called the Great Tribulation, where it gets much worse, okay? And we'll get into all that later, but just for clarity, here we're talking about this 3.5 years. He's saying that this guy will reign, and the persecution will come upon the saints from this Antichrist during those 3.5 years. He's going to be limited as to how long that persecution will happen. It's only going to happen 3.5 years. I do want you to turn for a second to Daniel chapter 12. Verse 7. Daniel 12:7 says, "Then I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river. When he held up his right hand, his left hand was in heaven. He swore by him who lives forever, it shall be for a time, times, and time and a half. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished." So again, he uses that numerology, right? Time, times, and time and half a time to indicate the 3.5 years. And if you skip over to verse 11 in chapter 12, it says that from the time that the daily sacrifice was taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, and we'll talk about all that later, there shall be 1,290 days. So that in days is 3.5 years, right? So 3 different times here in Daniel he mentions the 3.5 years for this persecution after the desolation, and again we'll get to that at another time. All right, so getting back to our clues. So the kingdom of Christ follows the final persecution of the saints by the final ruler of the final form of the final kingdom of the nations, right? So after the final persecution of the saints by that final ruler in the final form of the final kingdom, then comes the kingdom of Christ. There's one more clue. Okay. Now let's go back to verse 9. Chapter 7, verse 9. We covered some of this last week, but now it becomes more important. Verse 9, it says, I watched till the thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. Now, who's the Ancient of Days again?
God.
God is the Ancient of Days. His garment was white as snow, the hair in his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, and its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. So this is quite a court, quite awesome. If you have to stand before this court, right? 10,000s and 10,000s angels ministering to him, and the books are now open to see for the judgment. So look at verse 11. I watched then because the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. And as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And then we get back into verse 13, which we looked at already. I want you to skip down to verse 26 to see this court again. Verse 26, but the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So here we see that at some point in time, the final judgment ends. The final persecution ends, and there is a judgment of this small horn, if you will, the Antichrist who has taken over. He goes before the court. He is thrown down. He is destroyed, and then the kingdom of Christ is set up and goes on forever. It's interesting in verse 27, right, that the kingdom is given to the people, to the saints of the Most High. The saints actually inherit this kingdom, and the kingdom is everlasting and goes on forever. So at some point in time, the reign of this Antichrist is over when Christ's kingdom comes, and he defeats him, and then the kingdom goes on and reigns forever. So my last clue then is when does Christ's kingdom come? The kingdom of Christ follows the divine judgment after the final persecution of the saints by the final ruler in the final form of the final kingdom of the nations, right? So after the judgment, after the persecution of the final ruler, of the final form of the final kingdom of the kingdoms. Got it? Now you know exactly when the kingdom of Christ comes, right?
Exactly.
Put on your calendar, you know exactly when it is. Wrap this up. I want you to look at two other verses here that we haven't done. If you go back to verse 15 and verse 28. So verse 15, it says, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. And then verse 28, this is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. But what's going on with Daniel here?
It hurts to see God's people getting destroyed. You see the future, and it's not pretty, the part that they're letting them see.
Yes, anything else? Yes.
I just think overall it's just concerning just to see the destruction and the Antichrist coming up to power, and I'm sure it's just overwhelming just to see the whole vision of the end of this world, and
And so you guys are right. It's nothing more than that. I just see that Daniel is overwhelmed by the reality of what God has shown him about the future. God has shown him the future, and it is going to be this great destruction. There's going to be a lot of lives lost. We haven't even gotten into all the details of Revelations, right, and what happens. But Daniel is seeing this great destruction. He's also seeing great glory at the end, and this majesty and this amazing kingdom is going to go in, and it just breaks him down, and it just overwhelms him, right? I guess the thing that I wanted to point out here was that is our lack of being overwhelmed by this, right? We have the same revelation that Daniel has here, and we know what is going to, some of us have read Revelations and seen the really bad parts, right? We've seen the trailer for this thing at this point, but we know exactly what's going to happen to this world and to the kingdoms of this world and to the people and inhabitants of this world, and yet we're not overwhelmed and grieved like Daniel is. So I just want to point that out to you. We're gonna deal with that a lot more when we get into chapter 8. I can tell you just the response that Daniel has to all these things, but I just want you to recognize that we now understand what's going to happen to this world. The world doesn't understand what's going to happen to it, but we do. And we ought to have some incredible compassion, and it ought to break our hearts for the world because of knowing what's going to happen to them in the end times here. And it ought to spur us to action, right? It ought to spur us to, my God, we have got to go out and preach the gospel. We've got to go out and tell people about this truth. And so I think that's what's going on with Daniel. He's just like, oh my gosh, I've got to go out and tell people. I got to go out and help people understand who God is. And you see that as we talked about, Nebuchadnezzar trying to get a better understanding of who God is. There's no question that he ministered to Nebuchadnezzar. He ministered to Belshazzar. He tried to do his best to spread the word. And I just think that I just want us to feel it in our hearts in the same way that Daniel felt it in his heart. And again, we'll deal a lot more with that as we get into chapter 8 and some of the things that Daniel went through. All right, so one more time, when is the kingdom of Christ coming? Anybody coming?
Sometime in the future.
After now.
After now, yeah.
The Antichrist comes.
And he is after the persecution
of the saints.
After the final form of the final kingdom.
The final ruler of the final.
So let me say it one more time slowly. The kingdom of Christ follows the divine judgment after the final persecution of the saints by the final ruler of the final form of the final kingdom of the nations. That all makes sense to you, right? Those words all make sense, right, after we've gone through this? Right? Some of you go, some of you go, okay. Again, we will deal with this. This is the broad overview. We'll deal with the details of this as we get into the verses in the next couple of weeks. Well, I'm having fun. I got to tell you, going through this, I'm learning a lot, and it's also terrifying at the same time what I'm learning. So, anyway, so listen. First of all, it's great to see all your faces back. Especially after last week when I saw no faces because the thing was broken. But some of you who've been away, it's good to see you back. Great to have Tim back to us on Earth. So, well, y'all have a great Mother's Day. Hug one another, and we'll talk to y'all later.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.